Okay, now we're going to start first by talking about sensory nerves. Now, I know there was some confusion about the difference between um, between the unipolar, pseudounipolar, and multipolar neurons. So I just wanted to talk about that a little bit because it really does relate to the sensory nerves, because sensory nerves are essentially pseudo unipolar nerves. So our bodies have potentials to have several different types of nerves. One type is a nerve body with a long axon and no dendrites, and this would be unipolar. Now these are quite rare, and they really exist only in our special senses. Um, and so they kind of collect information. Like, for example, in the optic nerve, we have some um, unipolar nerves like this that just collect information. Now, there are axons from other nerves that synapse with the nerve body itself, but this nerve body here really doesn't have any significant dendrites. So, and again, these are fairly rare in the human body. Um, they're less rare in sort of invertebrate animals. Okay, so the other type that is the most common is the multipolar neuron, and these are neurons that have dendrites sticking out the backside, and a nerve body, and then an axon. Okay, so that's multipolar because it has one pole here and another pole here. And there's another one that's called bipolar that actually has a second axon in between here, and they're relatively rare as well in the human body as far as I'm aware. Now, the type that we are concerned about with the sensory nervous system is what's called pseudounipolar. And what happens is we develop these, during our embryonic development, we develop these unipolar neurons. But what happens is the axon actually branches into two, and then as we develop, these two axons actually get fused together and make one nice long axon. And this is what happens in our sensory nervous system. And what we have here is we have this very long axon that might go out to our fingertips. And when we touch something and we sense it, we have a action potential that travels up this axon, and it just bypasses the nerve body altogether, and then it goes into the dorsal root of the spinal cord. Let me keep that color the same. Into the dorsal root of the spinal cord, where the axon then synapses with other nerves. Okay, so it's called pseudounipolar because it sort of starts out with two pieces of axon, and then those two pieces get fused together to make a single pole. And there's a reason this is important is with the sensory nervous system, we have the spinal cord running down here. Actually, this part is in the spinal cord as well. But the nerve bodies, the soma of the sensory nerves, are actually sit outside the spinal cord, and this is very unique. This is different than what we have in the motor nervous system, where we actually have the cell body inside the spinal cord, and then the axons moving outside. And these are going to be multipolar. You're going to have nice happy dendrites here that are going to synapse. So what is it about the function between the pseudo-unipolar nerves? Well, essentially, it's nothing really complicated. It just means that um, the an action potential can travel, sort of in one direction without going through the soma at all. Whereas in a multipolar, it's set up to get information from multiple places, and the action potential has to pass through the soma before it makes its way down to the end of the axons. So this pseudo-unipolar neuron is set up very nicely for the sensory nervous system, where we have to have action potentials traveling very long distances, bypassing the soma and going right into the spinal cord. Okay, so what does this actually look like here? Let me give you a sort of an end-on view of. Let's take a picture of the spinal cord here. I'll choose a different color. So say we have the spinal cord here, and we're going to have gray matter in the middle. So, and this is where all the soma are going to be for the motor nervous system, and then there's white matter out here. Now the peripheral sensory nervous system branches way out here. So picture we have a nerve ending that starts out in our fingertips and moves up our arm, and what it does is it has its cell body here in a ganglion just outside and to the back of the spinal cord, and then this afferent sensory nerve goes into the dorsal root of the spinal cord. So this is the dorsal root. Okay, so the motor nerves actually come out, they have nerve bodies in here with dendrites branching off, and their axons come out through the ventral root, and they actually join together in one big giant nerve bundle and go out to the fingertips here. So they're sending information this outwards from the spinal cord, whereas this information is going inwards towards the spinal cord, and again bypassing the soma and going directly through the dorsal root. So the dorsal root has the sensory nerves, the sensory afferent nerves, and the ventral root has the outgoing efferent nerves. Now it's important to be aware of this anatomy because it has some useful aspects to it. For example, here I'm going to erase the words here. For example, if you think of the anatomy of the spinal cord here, we have meninges here. Just the oops, still got an eraser on there. We have the pia mater that is fused to the membrane here, and it kind of wraps up a little bit around the roots, the nerve roots. And then just on the outside of that, we have the arachnoid matter, remember? And it's got these little branches in it. And then that's going to contain the CSF. And then just to the outside of that, we have the dura mater. Now remember, with the brain, the dura mater, around the brain, the dura mater is actually fused to the skull. But with the vertebrae, I'm going to draw a little spinous process here. Let me draw this a little bit thicker so we can get them. With the vertebrae, here's a little spinous process, and the vertebrae kind of wraps around here, and then there's transverse processes going out here and here, and there's a little space for the cord in here, and then we're going to have the vertebral body, the bone here. Okay, so that's a vertebrae. And what's interesting here is instead of having the dural layer attached to the vertebrae, there's actually a small layer. There's a small little fat pad here, and this is called the epidural space. So how does this relate to the afferent sensory nerves? Well, if you take a little needle and you slide it up underneath the vertebrae and into this epidural space, and you infuse this fat pad with lidocaine, which is a numbing agent, then you're going to be bathing sort of this whole area with lidocaine, right? And it just so happens that this area is near the dorsal root. So it's going to tend to numb the sensory nerve first, right? So it's not going to numb the efferent motor nerve unless the person gets too much and it really starts to spread down to this ventral root area. Okay, does that make sense? Now, that brings me to a point. It's very interesting how does this lidocaine numb the nerve? And it's interesting to note exactly what lidocaine does. Lidocaine binds with the voltage-gated sodium channels. And stops the action potential. Keeps them from opening. Stops the opening, and therefore there can be no action potentials. Okay, so this is exactly how it's numbing the nerve. And actually, if you get an overdose of lidocaine, or actually sometimes we use it therapeutically for cardiac, to suppress action potentials in cardiac cells as well. But anyways, that's how lidocaines work, that's how epidurals work. And it works preferentially on the sensory nervous system because the sensory nervous system is coming in through the dorsal root. Okay, now we're going to take a little trip out to the tips of our fingers here at the very beginning of a sensory impulse. So here we go. I'm going to draw. Alright, so we've got a finger here, a little fingernail, and here in our finger we happen to have a little touch sensor. Now this touch sensor, here I'm going to draw it a little bit bigger up here. So this is one single nerve ending. So in this touch sensor we have, lined up here along the nerve axon, we have these fast-gated sodium channels that are ready to open up. And we've got, lots and lots of positive ions on the outside and negative ions on the inside. And then on the end of it, where our finger is touching the end, we have a special kind of sodium gate, and it's actually a mechanical sodium gate. What happens when we touch something, we actually bend this nerve a little bit. We might bend it open, and this will sort of pull the two sides of this protein pore apart and allow sodium to rush in. And when sodium rushes in, because of this sort of mechanical bending of this special sodium channel, then it's going to open up, then it's going to start a action potential, and it's going to get propagated through the voltage-gated sodium channels. So that's how the most simple type of sensors work. Now there's all sorts of other sensors that we have as well. There's some special sodium protein channels that get opened up, to temperature or to chemicals, um, whatnot. And all of them work by the same basic principle. The the sensation opens up some kind of sodium channel, some kind of specialized sodium channel to start an action potential. Okay, so generally, um, a sensation from one single nerve isn't really going to do a whole lot of good. In order for you to actually get the message up to your brain, you here I'm going to make a whole bunch of nerves here. We got a whole bunch of nerves. Now, say, you know, you accidentally poked yourself with the head of a pin or a scalpel or something like that. Hopefully not a needle um, that's from a patient, but that's been known to happen. So anyways, you poked yourself with the edge of a pin. Now, if you only manage to cause an action potential in one nerve fiber, it's probably, when it gets up to the spine in synapses, with another nerve, chances are it's not going to be enough impulse to propagate an action potential. So what do you need to propagate an action potential? You need some kind of summation. And I touched on this briefly when we talked about the central nervous system. So there's two different types of summation that could accomplish this. The first type is, if this pin kind of stays here, this nerve is going to fire off, maybe 24 impulses over the period of a second. And those 24 impulses, as they occur, each time one occurs, more acetylcholine is released into the synapse, and eventually it overcomes the threshold, and the synapse opens up. Okay, so that's called temporal summation, and that just means lots of impulses over time add together or create a sum that is able to open up enough ligand-gated sodium channels to activate an action potential here. Now the other one would be, now remember, a lot of these nerves are going to sort of synapse here. Remember, each nerve in the spinal cord can have hundreds and hundreds of synapses. So say we've got these little nerves here. We've got one going up here, and this one kind of connects directly here, and this one comes down here. Now say you poke yourself very, very briefly with the pin, but you poke it pretty deep. And when you poke it deep, it's going to cause your whole finger to sort of be indented, and it's going to open up these mechanical sodium channels in all of these nerves. And even though it was only a moment in time and each one of these nerves only sent out one single impulse, when you add them all together, you got one impulse here, a little acetylcholine, one impulse here, a little acetylcholine, one impulse here, a little acetylcholine. But between when all of them sort of get added up, in a sense, by this single nerve, and that reaches the threshold so that it can propagate a new action potential. And this is called spatial summation, where multiple nerves are involved. So temporal is essentially one nerve that has many impulses. Spatial is, many impulses spread over a number of nerves. And typically, no impulse is going to be sent from the peripheral sensory nervous system up to the thalamus unless there is some degree of summation involved. As we were talking about in the central nervous system, the individual nerves are very, very twitchy. So if we were sending up every single message that was being up to the brain, every single message that was being detected by these peripheral nerves, or every time one of these peripheral nerves fired, then we would be getting a lot of extra information that does not represent something real that's being sensed. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about with the peripheral nervous system, and particularly the sensory nervous system, is here we have a spinal cord. And way up at the top of the spinal cord, it goes through the medulla and then into the thalamus. And then the thalamus is sort of the base of the brain, right? Actually, let me move this up a little bit. And then we'll have, above this thalamus, we'll have the cerebral cortex. And that's a really rough drawing, but you get my point. So this is the cerebral cortex. This is the thalamus. Okay, so what happens with the sensory input? Okay, so say we have a sensory input coming in here. It bypasses its little nerve body in the ganglion, and then it synapses with the nerve in the spinal cord. And remember, there's interneurons and whatnot, so some of them synapse directly, some of them synapse into, interneurons. So in this case, we'll put a little interneuron here, and this might synapse again, and then this nerve goes up to the thalamus. And then, there's probably going to be some interneurons here in the thalamus. It may go through a series of them, and then eventually it's going to make its way up to the cerebral cortex, and specifically to the sensory motor area, or the sensory area of the cerebral cortex, and this is where we'll become aware of it, of that sensation. So one thing I wanted to point out here is we have different names for the neurons, and you'll probably hear this terminology. This first nerve that brings information from a sensory receptor up to the spinal cord is called the first order nerve. Now, the interneurons are just called interneurons. They're not really counted in this system. The nerve that carries information up from this level of the spinal cord, say we're down at L2, it brings it from L2 all the way up to the thalamus. This is called the second order neuron. And then again, the interneurons are just called interneurons. They're not really named. And then the nerve that brings information from the thalamus up to the cortex is called the third order neuron. Okay, now, Goiten, the textbook, goes into a lot of information about, the nerves that cross over to the contralateral side and move up versus the nerves that stay on the ipsilateral side and move up to the thalamus. And, they talk about all the different nerve tracts and which ones represent which sensations. And we're not going to get into that here. It's not information that I've found useful clinically, and it doesn't really help our understanding of many common pathophysiologies. Now, if you ever work in a neurology specialty, it may be something that you'll need to learn, but really for day-to-day practice outside of neurology, it's not really something that you need to know. Okay, so that is my overview of the sensory nerves. Next, I'm going to talk briefly about the motor nerves.